The news of the massacre reached Rome like lightning tearing through the sky on a tranquil night. 20,000 men, 3 complete legions annihilated in the shadowy forests of Germania. Emperor Augustus, the most powerful man in the world, wandered through the corridors of his palace, beating the walls with his fists, screaming in agony, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." But the legions would never return. Their bones bleached under the Germanic rain, and their golden eagles, sacred symbols of Roman power, remained captive in the sanctuaries of the barbarians. Rome, the eternal city, had plunged into mourning. The most formidable military machine of the ancient world had been shattered by tribes the Romans considered barely above wild beasts. The shame was unbearable, the fury uncontainable. And in that cauldron of intense emotions was forged a silent but implacable promise. There would be vengeance. Rome would not forget. Rome would not forgive. In the months following the catastrophe of 990, Rome found itself in a state of shock. Emperor Augustus, already an old man of 72 years, feared that the Germans would take advantage of their victory to invade Gaul. He urgently ordered the Rhine frontier to be reinforced, sending his best generals and legions to prevent any barbarian incursion into Roman territory. Meanwhile, in the streets of Rome, citizens whispered about ominous omens. It was said that statues of Augustus had been struck by lightning, that the Lycan Pines, protective gods of Rome, wept tears of blood. The emperor ordered expiatory sacrifices to the gods, but in his heart he knew that German blood would be the only offering sufficient to wash away the shame of Teutoburg. Germania must be punished, Augustus declared before the Senate, but the time for retribution must be chosen with wisdom, not with haste. That wisdom dictated that Rome must first secure its frontiers and reorganize its forces. Legions 17, 18, and 19 destroyed at Teutoburg were never reconstituted, their numbers never used again, as if erasing their memory could expedite the disaster. In their place, Augustus ordered the creation of new legions, trained specifically for the type of warfare that awaited them in the dense Germanic forests. In 14 AD, Augustus died, and his stepson Tiberius ascended to the imperial throne. The new emperor knew Germania better than anyone. He had spent years fighting on its frontiers and understood both the terrain and the mentality of its inhabitants. He knew that revenge would require an exceptional man, someone who combined political cunning with brutal military effectiveness. That man was Germanicus, Julius Caesar's nephew, an adopted son of Tiberius. Young, charismatic, and brilliant, Germanicus represented the best of Rome. Noble by birth, cultivated in arts and letters, but fierce in battle. Tiberius appointed him supreme commander of the 8 legions stationed on the Rhine frontier with a clear mission: recover the lost eagles and make Arminius pay for his betrayal. In the spring of 14 AD, barely weeks after Augustus's death, Germanicus crossed the Rhine with 4 legions and auxiliary troops, an army of more than 30,000 men. His first campaign was more a demonstration of strength than a full-scale invasion. The Romans razed villages, burned fields, and scattered the small bands of Germanic warriors who dared face them. It was the prelude to what would come, a bloody message sent through the smoke of burning settlements. The year 15 AD marked the beginning of true Roman revenge. Germanicus had spent the winter meticulously planning the campaign. He studied reports from Teutoburg survivors, interrogated Germanic prisoners, and drew detailed maps of enemy territory. He would not repeat Varus's mistakes. He would not underestimate Arminius nor allow himself to be trapped in the swampy Germanic forests. This time the strategy would be different. Instead of marching with his entire army through dangerous forest paths, Germanicus divided his forces. 4 legions under the command of Ous Caesenus Sees would advance overland through Brutary territory, while Germanicus would lead 4 other legions in a fleet of 1,000 ships that would sail the North Sea and then ascend the Ems River, penetrating deeply into enemy territory. The plan worked with military precision. The Germans, surprised by the naval maneuver, could not organize an effective defense. Germanicus' legions disembarked and began advancing inland, facing small resistance groups that were crushed with brutal efficiency. Meanwhile, Cinna and his legions carved their way with fire and sword through the forests, burning villages and massacring anyone who resisted. The Romans had learned the lessons of Teutoburg. They marched in more compact formations, sent scouts in all directions, and established fortified camps each night. Surprise was no longer a viable weapon for the Germans. On a gray and humid morning, Germanicus' legions arrived at a clearing in the forest. The silence that fell over the ranks was overwhelming. Before them stretched the scene of the Teutoburg massacre 6 years after the tragedy. Tacitus, the great Roman historian, would describe the scene thus. In the middle of the plain, whitened bones scattered or heaped according to whether they had fled or resisted. Beside them could be seen fragments of weapons and horse limbs, and there were also human skulls nailed to tree trunks. The soldiers contemplated with horror the remains of their compatriots. Germanicus ordered the march to halt. Through tears, he personally directed the collection of bones scattered across the battlefield. The legionaries, many of whom had lost friends or family in the massacre, worked in silence, gathering skulls pierced by Germanic spears, fragments of rusted armor bones that had been gnawed by wild animals. That night, under torches that illuminated the forest with a ghostly glow, Germanicus pronounced the funeral eulogy for the fallen, the bones impossible to identify individually, were buried in a communal mound. Over it, Germanicus placed the first turf, initiating a ritual that each soldier would continue, adding earth and stones until creating a visible monument, a testimony that Rome had not forgotten its lost sons. The ceremony had a profound impact on troop morale. They no longer fought only for conquest or glory. Now they sought justice for their massacred brothers, whose spirits seemed to watch them from the dark recesses of the forest, begging for vengeance. The army continued its advance, burning and sacking everything in its path. The Germans, unable to face the Roman military machine, directly resorted to guerrilla tactics, attacking small detachments and quickly retreating into the forest thicket. But Arminius, the architect of victory at Teutoburg, knew he could not defeat the Romans through minor skirmishes. If he wanted to preserve his position as leader of Germanic resistance, he needed a significant victory. The opportunity came on the banks of the Visurus River, present-day Vera. Arminius had gathered a large army of warriors from various tribes, motivated by fear and hatred of the invaders. The Romans camped on the western bank of the river, while the Germans occupied defensive positions in a sacred grove on the other side. During the night, Germanicus was informed by a Germanic deserter about Arminius's dispositions. The Cherushi leader had placed his infantry in the forest, while the cavalry remained hidden in adjacent woods, ready to attack the Roman flanks when they advanced. At dawn, Germanicus ordered the river crossing. His men swam or used small boats, quickly forming battle lines on the opposite shore. Unlike Varus, Germanicus had studied his enemy and prepared countermeasures for their tactics. He deployed his own cavalry in extended formations to protect the flanks, while the infantry advanced in tortoise formation with shields interlocked, forming an impenetrable wall. When the Romans entered the forest, the Germans launched their attack. Thousands of warriors emerged from among the trees, howling like wild beasts, wielding their long spears and wooden shields painted with tribal symbols. The initial impact was brutal. The first Roman line wavered under the ferocity of the assault, but discipline and training prevailed. Centurions shouted orders, maintaining unit cohesion even in the midst of chaos. The battle developed in multiple foci along an irregular front dictated by the nature of the forested terrain. At some points, the Germans managed to penetrate Roman lines. At others, the legionaries advanced methodically, step by step, leaving behind a trail of enemy bodies. Arminius fought in the front line, recognizable by his imposing stature and red cloak. His presence inspired his men, who redoubled their efforts wherever he appeared. Germanicus, equally conspicuous with his golden armor and purple cloak, personally led his troops, exposing his life like any common soldier. The turning point came when the Germanic cavalry, hoping to surprise the Romans on the flanks, was in turn surprised by auxiliary cavalry units that Germanicus had strategically positioned. Trapped between the forests and the disciplined Roman infantry, the Germanic horsemen were massacred. Their defeat sowed panic among Germanic ranks, which began to crumble. Arminius, wounded in the arm by a Roman javelin, tried to regroup his forces, but it was too late. The retreat became a rout, and the Germans fled toward the swamps and denser forests. Where the Romans could not pursue them effectively, Germanicus ordered the pursuit to halt at nightfall, conscious of the dangers of unknown terrain. That night, while the legionaries celebrated their victory, the defeated Germans retreated inland, carrying their wounded and leaving behind hundreds of corpses as testimony to Rome's vengeful fury. While Germanicus reaped victories on the battlefield, fortune did not smile equally on all Roman forces. Aulus Caecina, commanding 4 legions, was returning toward the Rhine when he was forced to take a route through swampy terrain known as the Long Bridges, a series of wooden walkways built years before by General Lucius Domitius over treacherous marshes. Arminius, after partially recovering from his wounds, saw in this situation an opportunity to replicate his success at Teutoburg. Knowing the terrain, he led his men by alternative routes to get ahead of the Roman column. The Germans destroyed sections of the walkways and diverted watercourses to flood the terrain even more, turning the path into an impassable swamp. When Cinna and his legions reached the long bridges, they found themselves in a precarious situation similar to what Varus had faced 6 years before. Carts sank in the mud. Men advanced with difficulty, and the columns stretched for kilometers, vulnerable to attacks from surrounding forests. The Germans were quick to attack. From the safety of elevated and dry ground, they launched a rain of projectiles on the Romans stuck in the mire. The situation worsened by moments. Many soldiers, remembering the horrors of Teutoburg, began to show signs of panic. But Cassina was not Virus. A veteran of countless campaigns, he kept calm in the midst of chaos. He ordered his men to abandon carts and non-essential supplies, to lighten the march and use the drier sections of terrain to establish a fortified camp for the night. During the darkness, the Germans intensified their attacks, trying to break Roman defenses. They threw burning torches over the palisades and attempted to scale the camp walls. The Romans responded with a rain of javelins and stones, keeping the attackers at bay. The situation seemed desperate. In his tent, Gina had a disturbing dream. He saw Quintilius Varus, bloodied and covered in mud, emerging from the marshes and trying to drag him toward the depths. Waking startled, the general gathered his officers. Varus was defeated because he forgot he was Roman. He told them, "We will not make the same mistake." At dawn, Cinna ordered a bold sortie. Instead of continuing the retreat through the swamp, where the Germans had all the advantages, he launched a surprise attack against enemy positions. The legions formed in wedge, charged against the unprepared Germans, who expected the Romans to continue their painful march through the mire. The ferocity of the Roman attack surprised the Germans. Accustomed to fighting against a defensive enemy, they were not prepared for the intensity of the Roman offensive. Cinna personally led the charge, his sword tearing flesh and bone, inspiring his men with his valor. The battle was brief but bloody. The Germans, disorganized by the surprise attack, were pushed back toward the forest. Arminius, trying to regroup his forces, received another wound, this time in the leg, and had to be withdrawn from the battlefield by his personal guards. With the enemy in retreat, Cassina reorganized his legions and continued the march toward the Rhine, this time by a safer, though longer route. He had barely escaped a second Teutoburg, turning a potentially disastrous ambush into a tactical victory that saved 4 legions from annihilation. The campaigns of 15 AD concluded with a favorable balance for Rome. They had inflicted severe defeats on Germanic tribes, recovered territory lost after Teutoburg, and demonstrated that Roman military might remain formidable. But a crucial objective still remained: recover the lost legionary eagle's sacred symbols, whose capture represented the greatest humiliation for Rome. Germanicus dedicated the campaign of 16 AD to this purpose. Again, he used naval strategy, transporting his legions by sea to the mouth of the Em. From there, he advanced inland, this time heading toward Angravari, territory allies of Arminius during the Teutoburg massacre. After several minor skirmishes, the Romans reached a fortress where, according to local informants, one of the lost eagles was kept. The fortress was well defended, situated atop a hill and surrounded by a palisade of logs. The defenders, conscious of the symbolic value of their trophy, were prepared to fight to the death. Germanicus ordered a full siege. The legions built assault ramps, mobile towers, and catapults. For days, the Romans bombarded Germanic defenses with stone projectiles and incendiary arrows. The fortress began to burn, but the defenders refused to surrender, preferring to die among the flames rather than surrender the eagle. Finally, after a week of siege, the Romans launched the final assault. The legions, formed in pseudo-tortoise formation, advanced under a rain of arrows and spears. Ladders were placed against the palisades, and the legionaries began to climb, driven by fierce determination. The fight on the walls was brutal. The Germanic defenders, knowing there was no hope of surrender or escape, fought with the desperation of the condemned. Many Romans fell from the ladders, their bodies crushed by rocks or impaled on sharpened stakes. But for every Roman who fell, 2 more took his place, driven by the vision of the eagle that waved provocatively over the fortress. Finally, an Opio non-commissioned officer named Marcus Ventidius, a native of Campa, managed to reach the top of the wall and establish a foothold. His comrades hurried to follow him, and soon dozens of legionaries were fighting inside the fortress, opening the way for hundreds more who entered through breaches in the defenses. Germanic resistance collapsed. The last defenders entrenched themselves in the central hut where the eagle was kept. Determined to die protecting their most precious trophy, the Romans set the structure on fire with torches, forcing the Germans to come out among the smoke and flames, where they were met by a wall of shields and swords. When the last defender fell, Ventidius entered the burning hut. Moments later, he emerged coughing and covered in soot, but holding high the eagle of Legio 19, blackened by smoke, but recognizable by its number engraved on the base. A deafening roar rose from the throats of thousands of legionaries. Men hardened by years of campaign wept without shame. The eagle, symbol of Rome's honor, had been rescued from ignominy. Germanicus personally took the recovered standard, kissed the blackened metal, and handed it to its designated bearer. Today he proclaimed before his assembled troops, "We have begun to wash away the shame of Teutoburg." Today, the shadows of our fallen brothers can finally find rest. The recovery of the legionary eagle inflamed the spirit of vengeance among the Romans. Germanicus, perceiving that the moment was propitious to deliver a definitive blow, decided to face Arminius in a pitched battle that would decide Germania's fate. Arminius, for his part, had managed to gather a new army, attracting warriors from tribes that until then had remained neutral. The brutality of Roman reprisals had convinced many that the only hope of survival was unified resistance. The two armies met on a plain beside the Visorgis River at a place called Idis Taviso. It was a vast expanse of open terrain flanked by forests and hills, ideal for the deployment of Roman formations. Arminius, conscious of the disadvantage this posed, tried to compensate by positioning ambushes in adjacent forests and preparing escape routes for an orderly retreat if necessary. The dawn of the battle day illuminated an imposing spectacle. The Roman legions, approximately 30,000 men, deployed in perfect formation, their standards waving in the wind, the sun reflecting on thousands of spear points and helmets. Facing them, the Germanic army, almost equal in number, but much less disciplined, extended in an irregular line, their warriors beating their shields with spears and chanting war songs. Germanicus rode before his troops, reminding them of the horrors of Teutoburg and the humiliation Rome had suffered. "Today we avenge our brothers," he shouted, and his voice was amplified by thousands of Roman throats. "Today Rome demonstrates why it rules the world." The battle began with an exchange of projectiles. Arrows, javelins, and slingstones darkened the sky while both sides tried to weaken enemy lines before hand-to-hand combat. Then with a blast of trumpets, Germanicus ordered the advance. The Roman legions advanced like an implacable war machine, their lines perfectly aligned shield against shield. The Germans responded with a savage and disorderly charge, trusting that their ferocity would compensate for their lack of discipline. The clash was tremendous. The first Germanic line crashed against the Roman shield wall, and for a few critical moments it seemed they might break it. But Roman discipline prevailed. The legionaries absorbed the impact, maintained their position, and began their deadly work, methodically stabbing with their short swords from behind their shields. Arminius, recognizing that frontal battle favored the Romans, ordered his flanks to gradually retreat, trying to draw the legions toward the forests where ambushes waited. But Germanicus, anticipating this tactic, kept his infantry in closed formation and sent his auxiliary cavalry to pursue the retreating Germans. The battle fragmented into dozens of minor confrontations across the field. In the center, the legions advanced inexorably, crushing Germanic resistance. On the flanks, Roman cavalry attacked retreating warriors, cutting off their escape routes to the forests. Arminius, seeing his plan fail, threw himself personally into combat, leading a desperate charge against the Roman center. His imposing figure, wielding an enormous spear decorated with eagle feathers, was visible from any point on the battlefield. His most loyal warriors followed him, forming a human wedge that headed directly toward Germanicus's standard. The clash was brutal. Germanicus's personal guards rushed to protect their general, forming a shield wall around him. Arminius and his men crashed against this barrier, their initial momentum carrying them through the first defensive line. For a moment, Arminius and Germanicus were mere meters apart, their gazes crossing in the midst of battle chaos. The German threw his spear with all his strength, but a Roman esquire interposed himself, receiving the mortal impact. Before Arminius could draw his sword, the second line of Roman guards counterattacked, forcing him to retreat. Arminius's desperate charge had failed, and with it the Germans' last hope. Enemy lines began to completely crumble. The retreat became a disorderly flight, and soon the battlefield filled with Germans running toward forest safety, pursued by implacable Roman cavalry. Arminius wounded again, but alive managed to escape with a small group of followers. As he rode toward forest thickness, he looked back one last time. The field he had planned to turn into a Roman trap had transformed into a slaughterhouse for his own people. Thousands of Germanic warriors lay dead or dying, while Roman eagles rose triumphant over the carnage. The Battle of Edesta Viso was a decisive victory for Rome. Not only had they defeated Arminius's main army, but they had demonstrated the absolute superiority of Roman discipline and tactics over the disorganized ferocity of Germans. After the victory at Edisto, Germanicus continued the campaign for several more weeks, pursuing the remains of the Germanic army and punishing tribes that had supported Arminius. Finally, with summer approaching its end and Roman forces exhausted by months of campaign, Germanicus ordered retreat to winter quarters west of the Rhine. As the legions marched back, a storm lashed the Roman fleet in the North Sea, sinking numerous ships and causing more casualties than any of the battles against Germans. Many saw in this a sign from the gods. Rome had obtained its vengeance, but Germania would remain a hostile and untamed land. In Rome, Tiberius received reports of Germanicus' victories with mixed feelings. On one hand, revenge for Teutoburg was complete. 2 of the 3 lost eagles had been recovered. Severe defeats had been inflicted on Germans, and Roman military prestige had been restored. On the other hand, Germanicus' growing popularity began to worry the suspicious emperor. In 17 AD, Tiberius ordered Germanicus to return to Rome, declaring that the war in Germania had concluded. The Cherusci and other rebel tribes, he wrote, must be left to their internal discord. It was a pragmatic decision. Complete conquest of Germania would require enormous resources and decades of occupation with uncertain benefits. Germanicus returned to Rome as a hero, celebrating a magnificent triumph in which Germanic captives paraded and recovered eagles were exhibited. But his glory would be brief. 2 years later, he would die under strange circumstances in Syria, possibly poisoned by Tiberius's order. Arminius, architect of Roman defeat at Teutoburg, survived the revenge campaigns, but his fortune also changed. Germanic tribes briefly united against Rome returned to their traditional rivalries. Accused of aspiring to kingship by his own compatriots, Arminius was assassinated by family members in 21A. Rome's revenge had been terrible but incomplete. Germania would never become a Roman province. The Rhine would remain as the empire's frontier for centuries. And Teutoburg's legacy would endure in the collective memory of Romans and Germans. For Rome, Germanicus' campaigns demonstrated that even the most catastrophic defeats could be avenged. The disciplined organization and implacable will that had built the ancient world's greatest empire remained intact. Rome had bled, but Rome had recovered. For Germans, resistance against Rome became a symbol of national identity that would endure through centuries. Arminius, known in German as Hermann, would be venerated as Germania's liberator, the man who had defied the world's most powerful empire. And despite his eventual defeat, had managed to preserve his people's independence. In the 19th century, when Germany sought to forge its national identity, Arminius's figure would resurge with force embodying the Germanic spirit of resistance and unity against foreign invaders. The Roman revenge campaigns in Germania had taken a terrible toll on both sides. Thousands of legionaries lay buried in foreign soil, far from marble mausoleums and offerings from their loved ones. Dozens of Germanic villages had been reduced to ashes, their inhabitants massacred or enslaved. The forest that once resonated with songs and laughter now kept silence, interrupted only by the calling of ravens feeding on war's remains. In Rome, news of Germanicus's victories was received with jubilation and relief. The Roman people, traumatized by Teutoburg's humiliation, could finally close that wound. The recovered eagles were placed with solemn ceremony in the temple of Mars Ult, the avenging Mars thus fulfilling the implicit promise in the god's name. However, for soldiers who had participated in the campaigns, victory had a bittersweet taste. They had avenged their fallen comrades, but had also witnessed and participated in atrocities many would prefer to forget. They had burned villages with women and children inside executed prisoners, profaned sacred places. The line between justice and vengeance, between duty and cruelty, had blurred in Germania's swampy forests. Tacitus, the great chronicler of these wars, would reflect years later on the profound meaning of these events. They create a desert and call it peace. He would write, questioning the moral price of Roman victory. Because although eagles had been recovered and military honor restored, something had been lost in the process. Tiberius himself, with his pragmatic decision to abandon Germania's conquest, seemed to recognize this fact. Rome was powerful but not omnipotent. There were limits not only geographical, but also ethical, beyond which imperial expansion lost its civilizing sense and became mere destruction. The Rhine frontier, established after Teutoburg's defeat and confirmed after the revenge campaigns, would become one of the empire's most stable and enduring. For centuries, Roman legionaries would watch from their fortresses the dense Germanic forests, remembering lessons learned at such high cost. And on the other side of the river, Germanic tribes would preserve their fierce independence, gradually transforming Arminius's memory from history to legend. When the last veteran of these campaigns died, taking with him vivid memories of those bloody days. Rome's revenge had already passed into the realm of myth. Winter night fires would be illuminated with tales of heroism and betrayal of lost and recovered eagles, of forests haunted by ghosts of unburied legionaries. And thus, in the collective memory of Romans and Germans, the tragedy of Teutoburg and subsequent revenge would intertwine inseparably, reminding future generations that even the most powerful empires can bleed, and that no revenge, however terrible, can truly restore what has been lost.